For more than 3,000 years, the galaxy had known silence. Not the empty silence of dead stars or drifting debris, but something rarer and more precious, the silence of chosen peace. No fleets burned through the dark between worlds. No planets were reduced to cinders. No species mourned its children lost to someone else's ambition. Every major civilization in the known galaxy had arrived, through different paths and different suffering, at the same quiet understanding that war consumed more than it ever created, and that the stars were worth more alive than scorched. Humanity was part of that peace, perhaps the most committed part of all. On Earth, the cities had grown tall and luminous, their spires catching sunlight in ways that ancient architects could never have imagined. Children learned history in classrooms where the old battlefields, Gettysburg, the Somme, Stalingrad, the ruins of New Singapore, were studied not as glory, but as wounds. Trade routes stretched between solar systems. Human merchants laughed with alien traders over shared meals in docking stations that smelled of a dozen different atmospheres. Diplomats spent their careers negotiating tariffs and cultural exchanges rather than ceasefire lines. For 3 millennia, the most dangerous thing a human was likely to encounter was a difficult negotiation or long journey through deep space. To the rest of the galaxy, this transformation seemed complete and permanent. The Galactic Council, that vast and ancient assembly of species who had navigated the universe long before humanity reached its own moon, watched the humans with a mixture of fondness and barely concealed condescension. Human ships were modest in number and rarely patrolled near contested borders. Human military installations, once a subject of some concern among neighboring species, had grown quiet. Their weapon systems went undemonstrated for centuries. Their soldiers, if they still had them at all, were never seen. To the Council's more powerful members, the conclusion was obvious. Humanity had been domesticated by comfort. 3,000 years of prosperity had done what no conqueror ever could. It had made them soft. This belief grew slowly, the way dangerous ideas often do, until it felt less like an opinion and more like established fact. The species that would eventually move against humanity did not think of themselves as aggressors. They thought of themselves as realists. Their civilization was old, older than humanity's first cities, older than the peace itself, and they had grown tired of watching younger species thrive under an arrangement that, in their view, only rewarded timidity. They had resources they wanted. They had ambitions they had suppressed for centuries under the weight of galactic convention, and they had studied humanity carefully enough to believe that the moment had finally come. In their command halls, generals reviewed centuries of accumulated observation. Human fleets, minimal. Human weapons development, stagnant, at least by visible metrics. Human border activity, nearly non-existent. The evidence, they believed, was overwhelming. 3,000 years of peace had turned humanity's ancient warrior instinct into a museum exhibit. They were proud of their analysis. They should have been terrified of how wrong it was. The armada they assembled was immense. Thousands of warships in perfect formation, a force that had dismantled civilizations before the Galactic Council was even founded. They moved through deep space with the confidence of a tide that has never been stopped. Their commanders did not argue about victory. They argued about terms of occupation, about resource extraction schedules, about how long it would take humanity to accept the new arrangement. Some of them smiled. When long-range sensors across the galaxy detected the fleet's movement, an emergency session of the Galactic Council was convened within hours. The chamber was enormous, designed to hold representatives of dozens of species simultaneously, each enclosed in their own atmospheric pocket, each watching the tactical displays with expressions that ranged from alarm to careful neutrality. And then there were the ones who smiled. They were subtle about it, a slight curve of a mouth analog, a posture that leaned back rather than forward, a tone in the voice that suggested foregone conclusions rather than genuine concern. These were the species that had long believed what the invaders now acted upon, that humanity's gentleness was simply cowardice dressed in diplomatic language. A single message was composed and transmitted to Earth. The age of peace is over. Prepare for war. The council chamber fell into an expectant silence. Representatives leaned toward their communication arrays, waiting for the human response. Panic signals, perhaps. Emergency evacuation coordinates. Desperate requests for alliance support. Maybe even the transmission everyone quietly anticipated most, a request for terms of surrender. They waited and waited. and received nothing. Human cities remained calm. Their ships continued their ordinary routes, cargo vessels completing scheduled deliveries, passenger transports arriving at stations on time, scientific vessels pursuing research in quiet corners of uninhabited systems. From every external sensor, every monitoring array, every intelligence network watching human space, the picture was the same: a civilization that had received a declaration of war and simply continued with its day. The invaders took this as confirmation of everything they believed. Inside their flagship, the supreme commander of the armada read the silence with a slow, satisfied nod. He was an old being, decorated with the honors of 6 previous conquests, and he had seen many species in the moments before their defeat. Some fought desperately, some pleaded, some tried diplomacy at the last possible second. But the ones who went quiet, those were always the ones who had already accepted the inevitable. They just hadn't said it aloud yet. A second message was sent. Your silence confirms your weakness. You have one final chance to submit with dignity. In a room on Earth with no particular architectural grandeur, just a long table, high windows showing a gray afternoon sky, and a quiet hum of advanced systems behind plain walls, humanity's senior commanders sat together and read the second message. No one raised their voice. No one looked frightened. The room had the atmosphere of professionals reviewing an agenda item they had long anticipated and thoroughly prepared for. Commander Adora Chen, who had spent 40 years in strategic planning and had the kind of stillness that comes not from the absence of emotion but from the complete mastery of it, set down the message and looked around the table. They are following the predicted path, she said, every deviation within acceptable parameters. Across from her, a man named Osei Mensa, head of Deep Systems Analysis, unassuming in appearance, extraordinary in mind, checked his display and nodded. Every move. They haven't surprised us once. Adora leaned back in her chair. Outside the window, rain had begun to fall. She watched it for a moment, this ordinary rain on this ordinary afternoon, and something crossed her face that her colleagues recognized. Not satisfaction, not triumph, but something quieter. Something close to sorrow that it had come to this at all. Good, she said finally. Let them come closer. The alien armada crossed invisible threshold after invisible threshold, and with each crossing, something changed, not in visible, dramatic ways, but in the subtle, cumulative way that current changes the behavior of a ship that hasn't noticed the water moving beneath it. Navigation systems aboard their warships began to report minor anomalies. Stellar coordinates that didn't quite align with stored maps. Communication signals that arrived fractions of a second later than expected. Sensor readings that flickered for just a moment before correcting themselves. Each error, taken alone, was easy to dismiss. Instruments malfunction. Space is full of interference. No system is perfect. The alien engineers logged the anomalies and moved on. Aboard the flagship, the Supreme Commander was briefed on the minor technical difficulties. He waved the report away. Keep moving, he said. Human space is already ours. We are simply traveling to collect it. His officers laughed. They should not have, because humanity had spent 3,000 years understanding something that the invaders had never had reason to learn, that the most dangerous weapon in any war is not the one that destroys your ships. It is the one that destroys your confidence in your own perception of reality. The truth of what humanity had done with its centuries of peace was known only to a very small number of beings in the galaxy, and all of them were human. When the age of peace began, humanity's leaders had looked at the long stillness ahead and made a choice that would have seemed paradoxical to any outside observer. They chose to treat peace as the most demanding military exercise in their history, not in ways that could be seen, not in ways that could be monitored or reported to the Council or misinterpreted as aggression, but with a patience and a thoroughness that 3,000 years of unbroken practice had refined into something almost incomprehensible in its depth. Human fleets were not disbanded. They were hidden, not in distant systems behind obvious defense perimeters, but built into the architecture of space itself. Stations assembled inside hollowed asteroids. Vessels constructed in dark orbits, cold and unpowered, their signatures indistinguishable from debris. Entire networks of infrastructure that existed on no public record, registered under no treaty disclosure, visible to no external censor. Their weapons were not abandoned. They were perfected in silence. Not the loud, demonstrative weapons of species who wanted their military strength to serve as deterrence through visibility, but patient weapons, systems designed not to destroy but to control, to redirect, to confuse, to manage the fundamental forces that govern movement through space. And their minds, human and artificial alike, had worked without pause for 30 centuries on a single problem: understanding how wars are won before the first shot is ever fired. Every alien military doctrine ever recorded had been studied, simulated, stress-tested. Every known species' decision-making patterns had been modeled in systems of extraordinary sophistication. Millions of scenarios, billions of variations. Artificial intelligences had run conflict simulations so complex that no human mind could fully comprehend their outputs, but the commanders who received those outputs understood the conclusion they all shared. Information is the first battlefield. Every other battlefield is just where the information gets expressed. When the alien armada entered human space, it entered a space that humanity had spent 3,000 years preparing. Every gravity well subtly modulated, every communication pathway monitored and, when necessary, gently altered. Every sensor returned from alien instruments shaped, with extraordinary precision, to tell a story that humanity had written in advance. The aliens were not traveling through human space. They were traveling through a trap so vast and so patient that they would never have believed it existed even if someone had tried to explain it to them. The moment of understanding came in stages, and each stage was more unsettling than the last. First, the alien ships began to slow, not through any visible mechanism. No force pressed against them, no field visibly impeded their progress. They simply slowed, as though space itself had thickened around them. Engineers scrambled through diagnostics, finding nothing wrong that they could identify or fix. Then the formations began to fragment. Ships that had held perfect positions for the entire journey found their coordinates drifting in ways that manual correction couldn't compensate for. The armada, so elegant in its discipline, began to look ragged at the edges. Commanders shouted orders. Officers relayed them. Nothing helped. Then the weapons powered down. This was the moment when fear finally entered the alien flagship in earnest. The Supreme Commander stood at the center of his bridge and watched his officers cycle through emergency protocols with increasing desperation, and for the first time in a campaign he had been certain of, he felt the cold presence of something he had not encountered in many years: genuine uncertainty. "Fire!" he ordered. His voice was still steady. It was the last moment it would be. Energy weapons lit the darkness of space. Brilliant, terrible, the product of engineering that had ended civilizations. They burned outward toward human space with everything the armada could deliver, and then they bent, slowly, gracefully, like light passing through glass of impossible complexity. The attacks curved away from their targets. Some dissipated into empty space. Some looped back on paths that defied the physics the alien engineers thought they understood. None reached anything human. None came close. In the alien flagship, someone whispered what everyone was feeling. "What is happening to us?" In the quiet room on Earth, an officer monitoring the tactical feeds looked up. "They've opened fire." Adora Chen did not look away from the window, where the rain had grown heavier. "Phase 1, she said simply. What followed was not a battle. It was a demonstration. Across the entirety of human space, systems that had slept for decades came fully online. Hidden platforms adjusted their positions with the silent precision of something that has been waiting for exactly this moment. Gravity modulation arrays reached operational capacity, and the alien armada, in the space of less than 3 minutes, went from a conquering force to something entirely different, a collection of ships that could no longer move where they chose, could no longer fire what they carried, could no longer even fully control the air circulating through their own corridors. Inside the alien flagship, the lights flickered. The air grew heavy in ways that had nothing to do with life support systems. Crew members looked at each other with expressions they had never expected to wear in the middle of what should have been a simple conquest, expressions of helplessness. "This is not war," an officer said, his voice very quiet. "No," another replied. "This is control." Then every screen on every alien ship in the armada changed simultaneously. A single image appeared, a human, a man of middle age, unremarkable in appearance, wearing a simple uniform with no medals, no decorations, nothing that announced rank or power. He stood in what appeared to be an ordinary room. He was completely calm. When he spoke, his voice carried no triumph in it, which was somehow the most frightening thing of all. For 3,000 years, he said, we honored the peace we built together, not because we were afraid, not because we had forgotten what war required. We honored it because we believed it was worth protecting, because peace, genuine peace, is the most difficult thing any civilization can choose to maintain, and we were proud to have chosen it. In the alien flagship, no one moved, no one spoke. The Supreme Commander stood at the center of his bridge and watched the screen with an expression that had moved over the course of the past hour from confidence through anger through confusion, and now into something it had never rested on before, humility. You saw our peace as weakness, the human continued. There was no accusation in his voice. He said it the way someone states a fact they find genuinely sad. You saw our silence as fear. You interpreted 3,000 years of restraint as 3,000 years of forgetting. He paused. We used every one of those years to prepare. Not for conquest, not for expansion. We prepared for exactly this, so that if the day ever came when someone looked at what we had built and decided it was easier to take than to own, we would be ready to demonstrate, clearly and without unnecessary destruction, why that calculation was wrong. Behind him, the screens filled with data, not propaganda images, not theatrical displays of military strength, but cold, precise information. Battle simulations, probability matrices, the complete tactical analysis of the alien armada's approach, showing that humanity's systems had predicted every movement, every decision, every order given aboard those ships, with accuracy that should not have been possible. The alien Supreme Commander stared at the numbers and understood, with a particular clarity that comes only to the very intelligent in the moments when they realize how badly they have misunderstood something, that the Armada had never had a choice. That from the moment they entered human space, every path that seemed to lead forward had been a path that humanity had already mapped and managed. They had not been invading. They had been guided, like water directed through channels, never aware that the landscape shaping its movement had been deliberately constructed. You declared war on us, the human said. But this war ended before it began. It ended 3,000 years ago, when we chose to spend our peace learning everything that peace would teach us, including this, that the surest defense against those who mistake patience for weakness is to let them discover their mistake themselves. He looked directly into the recording, and his expression was not that of a victor standing over a defeated enemy. It was something more complicated and more honest than that. We don't want your destruction, he said. We never did. We want what we have always wanted, to exist alongside the rest of this galaxy in the understanding that we all have more to gain from each other's presence than from each other's absence. That remains true today, regardless of what happened in the last hour. He let the silence hold for a moment. Leave now. We will not pursue you. We will not broadcast the specifics of what occurred here to the broader council, not to protect your pride, but because humiliation is not the same thing as understanding, and we prefer the latter. Another pause. This offer expires when the next order is given from this room. I would encourage you not to test how quickly that can happen. The screen went dark. The alien armada turned around. There were no parting shots fired, no defiant transmission sent. The thousands of warships that had crossed the galaxy with absolute certainty in their purpose simply reversed their course and began the long journey home, and the silence they left behind was different from the silence that had preceded their arrival. This silence had weight to it. It had memory. On Earth, in the quiet room, Adora Chen finally turned away from the window. The rain had stopped. The sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. She looked around the table at her colleagues, exhausted people, brilliant people, people who had spent their careers carrying a secret so large that it had sometimes felt like carrying the sky, and something passed between them that did not require words. "Any losses?" she asked. "None," said Osei. "Civilian disruption?" "Minimal. The routing adjustments we made to commercial traffic held within acceptable parameters. Most people won't know anything unusual happened until they see the news reports." Adora nodded slowly. "And the Armada?" "Retreating on the projected vector. If they maintain speed, they'll be out of our monitored space within the week." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Draft the council message. Standard channels. Keep it short." The message that went to the Galactic Council the following morning was 23 words. "Peace remains our choice. It always has been. We ask only that this truth be remembered going forward. The message spread through the galaxy with the velocity of genuine shock. In council chambers, old alliances were reconsidered with new eyes. Species that had long maintained confident positions about human timidity sat with intelligence reports they could no longer make fit the narrative they had believed. Military analysts across a dozen civilizations pulled up 3,000 years of observation on humanity and began the uncomfortable process of reinterpreting everything they thought they knew. The armada returned home to a reception far removed from the triumph their leaders had promised. The Supreme Commander gave his account in closed session, and those who heard it came out of the chamber changed in ways they struggled to articulate. What they had encountered was not a more powerful military. What they had encountered was something more unsettling than that, a civilization that had understood the nature of power so completely that it had never needed to display it. That was a detail that spread through the diplomatic networks and wouldn't stop spreading. Not the weapons humanity had, not the technology they had developed in silence, but the fact that they had possessed all of it for potentially centuries and had never once used it to intimidate, to threaten, to negotiate from a position of visible strength. They had let themselves be underestimated, deliberately, patiently, for 3,000 years. An alien captain who had served at the outer edge of the armada, young enough to still be asking questions, old enough to recognize when an answer mattered, sat in his small quarters on the journey home and tried to understand what he had experienced. He was not a philosopher by training, but the events of the past week had a way of making philosophers of people who would otherwise have remained simply soldiers. He thought about the human speaker on the screen, the calm voice, the absence of gloating, the offer of dignity to an armada that had come to strip a civilization of everything it had. He thought about the smile he had seen on the faces of human commanders in the brief visual feeds that had circulated through the ship, not the smile of someone who has won something they wanted, but the smile of someone who has confirmed something they already knew. And he thought about a concept that his civilization had never quite put into words, because they had never needed to, the concept that perhaps the truest expression of strength is not in the moments when you use it, but in the centuries when you choose not to. He sat with that thought for a long time. On Earth, life continued. There were no parades through the wide streets of the great cities, no monuments commissioned, no victory speeches broadcast, no national days declared. The events that had just reshaped the political landscape of the known galaxy were acknowledged in news reports that ran alongside updates about weather patterns, scientific discoveries, and an unusually good harvest season in the southern hemisphere. For most people, this was not indifference. It was something closer to its opposite, a deep, settled confidence that required no external validation. They had never doubted the outcome, not because they were arrogant, but because they understood what had been built on their behalf over 3,000 years of invisible, patient work. They understood that they were the inheritors of a choice their ancestors had made, to be ready without being threatening, to be powerful without being loud, to protect peace not by treating it as fragile, but by making themselves more capable of defending it with every year that passed. Adora Chen spent the evening after the Armada's retreat sitting on the steps outside the building where the decision had been made, watching the city move through its ordinary evening. People walking dogs, restaurants filling with dinner crowds, children chasing each other through a park across the street, their laughter carrying through the cool air. Osei Mensa sat beside her. They had worked together for 20 years, and they had learned long ago that certain moments do not require conversation. After a while, Osei said quietly, "Do you think they'll try again? Any of them?" Adora considered this for a moment, watching a child in the park spin in circles until she fell over laughing. "Some of them will think about it," she said. "For a while." She paused. "But they'll keep thinking about it. And every time they do, they'll remember what they don't know about us, what they can't see." She watched the child climb back to her feet and start spinning again. That's the thing about invisible strength. You can't stop fearing it once you've glimpsed it, because you have no way to measure where it ends. Osei nodded. "We never told them everything," he said. "No," Adora agreed. "We never did." The city moved around them, luminous and ordinary and quietly extraordinary, and above it the stars emerged one by one from the darkening sky, stars that humanity had traveled between, traded beneath, and chosen, again and again across 3,000 years, to protect. Not with fire, not with displays of force that invited challenge. With understanding, with patience, with a willingness to be underestimated for as long as it took, and to be ready for the moment when someone finally put that underestimation to the test. Far across the galaxy, in quarters that smelled of recycled air and the particular loneliness of a long retreat, a young alien captain picked up a pen, an old-fashioned instrument, the kind used for things that matter, and began to write. He wrote about a civilization that had chosen peace not as a surrender to the way things should be, but as the most sophisticated long-term strategy he had ever encountered. He wrote about a species that had mastered the rarest discipline in the universe, the discipline of knowing exactly how much you are capable of, and saying nothing about it. He wrote until his hand hurt, and then he kept writing. Because some truths are too important not to be recorded, and because he suspected, with the quiet certainty of someone who has just had his understanding of reality fundamentally revised, that the galaxy had a great deal more to learn about humanity. They always had. The stars turned slowly overhead, patient, ancient, indifferent to the ambitions of the small, brief things that moved between them, and humanity's peace held, as it had always held, not because the universe was kind, but because humanity had made itself into something the universe would think very carefully about before disturbing. A warning written in silence, a strength measured not in the wars it had won, but in the wars it had made unnecessary, and a smile, calm, certain, enduring, that the galaxy would never quite be able to forget.